Well, the first thing to say is that Britain's a very, very financialised economy, right? That Britain relies on finance and the finance sector probably more than most developed economies as a proportion. And that's been the case, pretty much certainly since the 1980s and the decline of Britain's manufacturing sector. And that kind of means a couple of things, or we need to have a couple of kind of starting points in that discussion. The first thing is that the relationship between the government and financial companies, the banks, but other forms of financial, other companies in that industry have a very close relationship. So there is a very close relationship between the government and the finance sector in this country. The second thing is that Britain is really not just a world leader in financial services, but it positions itself in that way. So the entire debate about Brexit, when it comes to thinking about the economic impacts, one of the few positive things that commentators will say economically about Britain is that it can entrench its position in financial services. Now, that's highly questionable for a number of complex reasons, but nonetheless, that is what's going on. Britain likes to talk about itself and position itself, and politicians try to support that as a leader in financial services. And these two things are a problem because the financial sector, we know, is particularly vulnerable to corruption and fraud. Okay, how do we know that? Well, I mean, there's almost a daily, certainly weekly diet of stories about the financial sector which are related to some form of fraud or malpractice or corruption. And if you think about just think about the banking sector, just think about the four big British banks. The charge sheet is incredible. Even if you just think about the last 10 years or so, we have a number of cases in which multi-million dollar and multi-million pound fines, totaling hundreds of millions, actually, have been imposed on all of the four major banks. I might run through, if you indulge me, I might run through some of those, because I've got just a very small part of the charge sheet here in front of me.
Feel free. I mean, they're not being spoken about anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, look, they do kind of. I think, to be fair, some of these cases that I'm about to mention do come into media discussion every now and then. Mm-hmm. But then when they die off, and another case emerges, which is normally fairly quickly, another case of corruption in banking or fraud in banking or whatever it might be, the dots are not joined together. So we don't see this sector as being endemically corrupt. But let's see what we think about when I just list some of these cases. So, as I say, just the last 10 years, Lloyd's were fined $350 million for sanction busting in 2009. Barclays, almost $300 million for money laundering the year after. 2012, HSBC were fined $2 billion. That was a fairly widely reported case. $2 billion for money laundering, 2012. Lloyd's have been fined for PPI, $117 million in 2015. A number of other, Alliance and Leicester and a number of other financial institutions also fined for PPI. All of the major banks were involved in those dodgy practices related to selling protection insurance. Barclays, HSBC, Lloyd's and RBS were all fined hundreds of millions of dollars for their manipulation of the LIBOR, the London Interbank lending rate scandal, which was 2012 to 2014. Yeah. Those fines. The following year, you begin to see fines for actually very similar practice, fixing the foreign exchange rates. I don't know if you remember that. Again, Barclays, HSBC, Lloyd's, RBS, hundreds of millions for their involvement in Forex. And then a little bit more recently, 2016 to 2018, we saw a whole raft of fines for the manipulation of mortgage products, which partly precipitated the collapse of the economy in 2008. The global financial crash was partly related to dodgy mortgage products that were being sold on the back of the American housing market. We've got Barclays, HSBC and RBS, again, fined hundreds of millions of pounds for those. And maybe the most, I think the most recent was RBS, were fined about $4 billion last May. They've been fined a total of $10 billion in that case. Barclays, $2 billion. So very serious offences, very serious fines. You'll remember the HSBC Swiss bank frauds, 300 million euro fine for that in 2017. So I could go on and on. Actually, I'm only halfway through the list here, halfway through the charge sheet. But what we have is systematic practices which are either fraudulent, unambiguously fraudulent, corrupt, or in some way trying to rig the market. And these are the four biggest British banks, household names, that are up to this on a routine basis. So, what does that mean?
Yeah.
It means we have to think about corruption just in that one sector, and just in that part of the financial sector in banking as routine, as large scale, and as a real serious problem, because these practices threaten not just the economy, they also threaten the ability of the rest of us to use our earnings, use the money we earn at work properly. You know, when you fix the LIBOR rate, it affects every single one of our mortgages. We might not be able to see that, or credit cards, or the loans we get from payday lenders. Those rates are affected directly by those practices. We might not be able to measure it, but this has a real serious consequence for society. So when you have Transparency International and the Corruption Perceptions Index, and Britain coming relatively high in the world rankings as one of the least corrupt, we have to say that's complacency, because that's, as long as Transparency International have been measuring corruption, Britain has looked quite good. And for as long as that charge sheet has been going on, actually the banking sector has been looking like it's systematically corrupt. So there are big questions about how we measure corruption, big questions about how we deal with corruption in this country, and big questions about what the consequences are in social terms and in terms of how we lose out as ordinary taxpayers and ordinary wage earners and so on.
So it sounds like the system has actually punished the banks by giving them these fairly large fines. Is that actually the case?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent that is the case, except the banks absorb those fines very easily, indeed so. I mean, the fine against the Royal Bank of Scotland that I mentioned earlier, the 3.6, it was over $4 billion, but 3.6 billion pounds. After that fine was announced by the US authorities, the chief executive of RBS, Ross McEwen, said our shareholders will be pleased. The shareholders will welcome.
The shareholders would welcome a fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's partly because they thought the fine was going to be a bit larger, but it's largely because they knew the bank had kind of accounted for that and they could absorb it. And in fact, the share price that morning rose by 5.5%. So the market is responding, and also in a way that would indicate that the fine's not really doing its job.
I mean, in a logical world, you would have expected that a bank given a fine would lead to a share price fall, not in fact a rise. Especially
a fine of that magnitude, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, it's not nothing, is it?
Right.
3.6 billion pounds. But if you look at those mega fines, and it tends to be the American authorities in recent years have imposed mega fines for financial corruption, fraud, and for various practices, money laundering, and all the things that I mentioned earlier. If you look at the five biggest fines imposed against the four British banks, HSBC, RBS, Lloyds, and Barclays, you find that of those 20 fines, the share price tends to go down. The share price goes down in the first week in 16 out of 20 of those cases. In fact, actually in 4 out of 20, the share price goes up. But if you take it over a longer period, if you look after a month, in 10 cases the share price goes up, in 10 cases the share price goes down, right? So it's not really, after a month, it's not really having much of an impact. And what market purists would say, okay, but that's the market adjusting. And the market probably adjusted a long time before that. The market probably adjusted when whoever it was, the FBI or the Department of Justice or the SFO, announced that they were investigating. But if you look at the dates that these investigations commenced, you see something very interesting. You actually see that again, it's about 10, going up and down. The share price is not affected at all, even by the announcement of a major investigation into LIBOR or into Sometimes the share price goes up, sometimes it goes down. So there's no real discernible effect of those fines. And I think that's really that raises big questions, because one of the responses actually of people like me and you who are really concerned about fraud and corruption in the finance sector would be to say, it's a kind of almost a kind of received wisdom. We would think, okay, well, fine them more, give them real meaningful penalties, real meaningful fines, and then we'll see them change their behaviour. And that doesn't seem to be the case. Now, I'm not arguing for lower fines, of course. So, I'm not saying that's where the argument should go. Mm-hmm. But I am saying that we are at a point where it looks like the fines themselves are part of a kind of process where the system corrects itself and then just reproduces precisely the same conditions, right? Because the list I gave you earlier on, the charge sheet I gave you earlier on, was a list of cases going back to 2009 that are similar practices just being repeated and repeated and repeated, no matter how big the fine is. So it's not an argument to not impose mega fines, but it does tell us that those fines are not necessarily doing the job that we expect them to do.
That we need to be moving towards some sort of re-regulation. I mean, what capacity do bodies like the SFO even have to be able to properly deal with this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the SFO is it's not particularly well funded. I mean, it's as a regulatory body, it's probably relatively well funded. But if you compare it to how some things are prosecuted in other areas of life, I mean, we're talking about roughly 40,000 burglaries are prosecuted every year in this country. The SFO handles about 20 cases, right? So I mean, and that's partly because they're huge, complex, and expensive, and they're complex and expensive partly because of the nature of them, but also because they're dealing with some pretty powerful people, and they're up against very, very well-resourced corporate law teams as well, right, or individuals' law teams. So there is it's worth doing those kind of comparisons, but there is a point in which we say, okay, well, maybe using the law in that way is not the purpose. Maybe we should be thinking about re-regulation in a different sense. Maybe we should be thinking that some of the things that we legitimize should simply be outlawed or not permitted, right? Why should we have a system in which a company like the Royal Bank of Scotland can get involved in those kind of practices when it's still owned by a majority of the British people? We are still the majority shareholder as taxpayers in the Royal Bank of Scotland. So we have some power to order the priorities of the Royal Bank of Scotland. And certainly after the financial crisis, the crash in 2008, and the bank bailout, we had an opportunity, not just in the RBS, but the other banks that the public bailed out. We had a chance then to say, okay, we can have a nationally coordinated banking system which is there for the public interest and not simply to make profits in any way that we can from any market that we can, which is let's be honest, that's the dominant logic of the banking sector.
Yeah. So
I think we need to, of course, criminal law prosecution is important, right? And we need to think in very kind of clever ways about that, but we also need to think about the basis of the organisation of the banks. Now, if we've been clever about thinking about the way we use punishment, the first thing we have to contemplate is that when those mega fines are imposed, they're imposed on the corporation itself. They're imposed on the corporate person, right? I mean, they sound quite punitive, right? The corporation, as a kind of edifice, the corporate person, it stands between the fine and the shareholders, the people who benefit from the company's profitable and sometimes illegal or fraudulent activity, right? And it's the corporation that absorbs the fine, right? So there's a major question to be asked about the structure of corporations more generally, right? Because what happens when RBS gets a 3.6 billion fine, is that it's free to distribute the costs and to obviously in financial planning to build in some kind of contingency for those costs, but to decide where the costs of that fine are going to be drawn from, right? Is it going to be, the closure of branches and pushing investment into a particular area where they know they're going to get fast, quick returns? Is it going to be even downsizing their headquarters? Is it going to be, whatever it might be? They get to choose how those costs are distributed. And in that sense, and they're never, or very rarely, do shareholders take a major hit, as I've just explained.
When you are a corporation that massive, you've surely got your fingers in as many pies as there are, so to speak. So you could, like as you say, draw the money from basically anywhere.
Yeah. So that means we shouldn't be defeatist. It doesn't mean we should say, okay, there's no point in fining companies, and it doesn't mean that we should say, there's no point in using the law. It means we just have to be a bit more clever about how we do it, and we have to think about the structure, the basic structure of the corporation, and the structure of power, and also how the people who stand behind the corporation, the owners and shareholders, use the corporation as a shield or as a corporate veil, as corporate lawyers would call it. So, I think that when we are thinking about those kind of fines, we should be thinking, okay, how do we apply them in ways that pierce the corporate veil, in ways that punish the beneficiaries of the corporation, in ways that are about some kind of retributive action against that very privileged group of people who never have to pay for the things that they benefit from. And there are ways of doing that. You can impose a fine which, for example, we don't. This is a kind of a proposal that's never been put into practice, but it could be put into practice. American corporate lawyers have proposed that, for example, if a company is fined, that you impose an equity fine. And so instead of the Royal Bank of Scotland having to pay £3.8 billion in a cash fine, they would have to reissue shares to that value, and those shares would be held in the public interest. So that's a way of piercing the corporate veil, because it means that shareholders lose out. It means that the public gets a say over what happens to a new part of the bank, or at least has a say over that proportion of the bank's earnings and income, or has some kind of added say in an annual meeting of shareholders and so on. That's not a perfect solution either, because we've got the Royal Bank of Scotland, the bank that I'm using as the example, is currently majority owned by the public sector. We just don't use that shareholding to do anything socially useful. But there are ways we could do that, and we could think about how banks could be more orientated to lending for socially productive means, rather than simply just generating financial profit on the back of new investments in financial products.
It seems as what you've just spoken about there is a series of relatively abstract activities that people are kind of unaware of because they stand so far outside of their daily lives. And yet people are, as you've pointed out just now, very affected by these forms of activity. Could you give us some of the largest examples of how corruption has affected people in their daily lives over the past couple of years in the UK?
I mean, there's a big debate now about PFI and the extent to which PFI has allowed private sector providers to, increase the burden on us as taxpayers and profit from the back of it. So PFI or PPP or those public-private deals which fund large-scale public sector infrastructural projects, building hospitals, building schools and bridges and so on. They effectively cost us as taxpayers anything between 3 and 5 times the cost of the original project if the public sector had paid for it, but we pay for it over a period of 15, 20, 25, 30 years. So it's not very good value for money, but we don't we don't have to pay for it until 25 years down the line, unless things begin to unravel as they have done with Carillion. So PFI was already a bad deal. And the other thing I'll say about PFI in terms of how it affects us, most of the money in PFI deals leaves the country. Most of the money ends up in secrecy jurisdictions, or as we call them more commonly, tax havens. So most PFI money goes to tax havens because the companies set up vehicles in which they can do that. So the money that we fund those public projects, the profits don't even get spent or recycled in the British economy. That's the first thing. They're not value for money. We know anyway. But when things unravel, like the Carillion corruption case, the Carillion collapse case, we find that the taxpayer is not only bailing out, and we've yet to see the extent of that bailout, but the taxpayer has to take on the burden that was supposed to be taken on by the company like Carillion in the first place. So if anyone saw the episode of Hospital on BBC Two last week, or certainly the week before this interview was conducted, they had the episode was filming in the Royal Liverpool Hospital, which was a Carillion project, and there's water coming through the ceiling in operating theatres. The power isn't working. People's lives are being put in danger because they hadn't managed to get a contractor in place to replace Carillion, because there'd been all kinds of toing and froing at a central government level about how they were going to deal with the project. So not only are we measuring this in financial costs, but when it comes to hospitals and schools, there was a very different scandal in Edinburgh a couple of years ago where a number of PFI built schools began to crumble and put children's safety at danger. So we can, because those projects are not being managed democratically, through any kind of public accountability, it means that we have serious problems when things begin to unravel, and we have serious problems in picking up the pieces. Now, the Carillion business model is actually the same business model that most outsourcers use. They call it the outsourcing sector. So other companies like MITI or Capita or Kia or some of the big construction firms use that same model. And what they do essentially is they have no real assets, they have no tangible assets, but they rely upon the bookable value of the public sector projects that they're continually working on. So Carillion was booking the value of future products, the value of future projects as current revenue. That was part of the problem. When it collapsed, it had 1.3 billion in debt.
It was essentially saying we are going to be doing something in the future, therefore that value is something we already hold and not offset against our liabilities.
Exactly. But it wasn't breaking the rules. I mean, this is kind of actually it was using European accounting standards, but it only had 29 million in cash in the bank. So that's a problem, because that model is perhaps not to those extremes, but that model is being used across the outsourcing sector. And there was a recent report by analysts called Company Watch, who were basically saying that if you look at 5 or 6 of those companies, they could possibly go the same way as Carillion, because they're using the same, and I quote, bankrupt business model, the same bankrupt business model that Carillion were using. So, instability in public services, public health and safety at risk, and an even bigger cost to the taxpayer. That's how we can put the human costs and the cost to all of us of what looks from the outside to be a corrupt model. But I will stress that actually, this is a model that the British government still by and large applies, and in a different form, not the same form as the old PFI, but in a different form encourages and replicates. The other thing to say about Carillion is, what about workers? What about the people that worked for Carillion? What about the pension schemes of all of the companies that Carillion bought over? Companies like Molam and the other construction companies that it bought over, and then had a cavalier attitude to the pension pots. That's another thing that's yet to unravel. And at the same time, it was paying out. I mean, I've just mentioned it. It ends up with 1.3 billion in debt. Over the course of its lifetime, it paid out more than $750 million to shareholders. So, I mean, I think these are big questions about how we organise the economy, right? Not just the public sector, but how we organise the economy. You know, can we have a sustainable economy that's based upon not falsification, but a kind of on the never model? You know, booking accountancy on the never. You know, the revenue will come in at some point in the future, and then when it doesn't, the shareholders, many of them got out early enough, and they leave workers and people who are owed pensions in the lurch. And that's, you know, that's increasingly what we risk when we have an economy that's financialized in that way.
You just mentioned this idea of the corporate person. What's the difference between the corporate person and the average person?
Well, it's interesting. That's an interesting way of putting it, because that in a way is the way that it's practically put. Corporations very often want to have an interest in them being seen as closely, in legal terms, as closely as possible to real persons in terms of their status, right? So corporations in the European Court of Human Rights can appear as parties claiming their human rights that some people might be aware of. Corporate persons act in all kinds of ways as contracting parties. So if I work for a private company, if I work for a corporation, I'm employed by the corporate person. I'm not, my contract is with the corporation rather than with any individual within the corporation, right? So as far as possible, when it suits the corporation and its shareholders and its owners, the corporation acts as if it is a person. And when it comes to criminal responsibilities or responsibilities for the kind of fines that we've been talking about, it also suits the corporation to be a person. You try telling anybody on the street, or you try telling me, that a corporation should go into the European Court of Human Rights and be entitled to the same rights that you have, or that somebody who's been beaten up by the police in the back of a van, has exactly the same rights to go to the European Court of Human Rights and take a case as BP or as Patisserie Valerie or whoever it might be. So of course, to ordinary people, it's just a ridiculous notion. But in law, it actually works as a very important source of power for corporations. And we take it for granted. We take it for granted that corporations have this kind of identity that is also underpinned by all kinds of legal practices and legal norms, and also in law, right? So it's a problem I think we don't contemplate enough, because if you begin to say, okay, well, actually, I don't necessarily want to have my employment contract with an abstract person, right? I don't necessarily want an abstract person to be paying for the fines that a bunch of powerful people standing behind that corporate person have been doing. I would rather have a world where there isn't this corporate veil, where there isn't a corporate person. Then you ask very fundamental questions about the economic structure of society and about social relationships within society. And there are no easy solutions to that. But one of the things that we could do, if we're not comfortable with the notion of the corporate person, and we think that it's not serving society in the way that maybe the people who benefit from the corporation think it's serving society, then we need to be doing something about it, right? And I think we need to be thinking about what the corporation really is if it's not a person. What the corporation really is a vehicle through which shareholders and owners can exert their rights. So in law, shareholders of a company are not owners, right? So it's very commonly made mistake that the shareholders are equated to owners. No, no. In legal status, any property that the corporation, any assets of the corporation is owned by the corporate person, right? Shareholders have some rights to the way those assets are used. They have rights to make decisions about the way those assets are used, and they have rights to benefit from those assets, right? They're very strong, actually, very rights that are established in law as much as, if not more than any other rights. Okay. So from that kind of, if we take that as a starting point, the corporate person is based on the idea that shareholders have rights, and the corporate person is the notional legal owner. If we want to do anything about the corporate person, then we have to think about the rights that shareholders have, and we have to think about rolling back some of those rights. If we think that the corporation is in a position now that's not serving society, we can talk all we want about corporate social responsibility, and in many ways, arguing for corporations to be more responsible reinforces this idea of the corporate person, because we're kind of saying this abstract corporation should be more responsible. No, we want the real human beings who are benefiting from the corporation to be more responsible.
Right.
Now, whether they can be more responsible within a corporate structure is another question.
But they might then have some kind of incentive to ask their corporation to stop doing whatever financial malpractice they're engaged in, because it would hurt them personally.
Yeah, perhaps,
right.
but very often that, I mean, you look at the history of the most harmful products we have, right? Most have been developed by companies that either have very powerful individual owners or companies that are based on a shareholding model. So think about tobacco, asbestos, the development of highly toxic plastic products, vinyl chloride based products, or we think of any other harmful substance that's been marketed. In the very early days, the owners and the shareholders knew that the products were deadly, right? And asbestos, the first evidence was actually in the 19th century, that it was a killer. Evil dust was the phrase used in Parliament. Tobacco, the first evidence linking tobacco to cancer was the 1920s. And the same for the vinyl PVC or vinyl chloride based polymers.
And climate change, I hear.
Yeah, of course. So we have very, very, very early warnings about highly dangerous, highly toxic substances that are being manufactured and developed by companies. And what's the response from the owners and shareholders? It's to intensify and support the company's intensification of the denial, but also of the attacks in all of those three industries. They were very heavily funded attacks on scientific knowledge, attempts to distort, silence scientific knowledge that was showing those products to be harmful, and that was supported fully by the shareholders and by the. So these are extreme examples, but we could actually sit forever and talk about cases of really serious human harms that have been supported by the shareholders model. So I think if we talk about climate change, we've got a serious problem on our hands, because the main companies, there's a report done last year which showed that 70% of greenhouse gases, 70% of those substances are being produced by less than 100 companies.
Yeah, I read that
companies.
one.
Yeah. So if we are saying, okay, that's the status quo and we're going to leave that the way it is, then what we're saying is the future of the species, the future of the planet is the hands of a very small number of companies, and the individuals within those companies may have with the best will in the world, may be committed to changing the situation and to saving the world, to saving or to making our ability more kind of at least a little bit more survivable in the long term. They may have the best intentions in the world. It won't make any difference, because they work within a model which always puts financial measurement before the measurement of any human cost or human harm or cost to the environment.
Yeah.
Not even profit.
Yeah.
It's not even profit. Things are just measured in terms of financial cost. And so that model is leading us to a very dangerous place. And I would argue we need to look at ways of breaking that model.
So given how drastically we have to change the structure of corporations in order to have any kind of effect on tackling financial malpractice, it seems to suggest that these institutions are almost corrupt by design, that they're not actually doing anything that they're not supposed to be doing, because corruption is so endemic and so seemingly unsolvable. So is that the case? Are they corrupt by design?
I think there's 2 points to make here, and the first point is, look, if you look at almost any definition of corruption, they'll have a kind of formula somewhere which says undermining the public interest for private gain or for private interest, right? And of course those terms are very broad, but you'll find a similar formulation in Transparency International and the World Bank definitions of corruption. And if you think about it, everything we've been talking about is the public interest being undermined for private gain by either chemical companies or tobacco companies or the banks, right? So that's what's going on. We have to say that's what's going on in almost every sector, or at least the public interest is subjugated to private gain, right? So it might not be compromised or undermined, but it's not really the most important. It's never the most important issue, and of course that's underpinned by the every attempt to reform the corporation. So to say this is a model that's corrupt by design, when there have been attempts to reform the corporation, they never really touched that formulation. So the fiduciary duties of directors at the most basic level are to pursue the success of the corporation. That in law is almost always interpreted as pursuing the best interests of shareholders. So if that's the primary duty, and all attempts, and there have been several attempts to reform this in law, the most recent significant one was the Companies Act 2006 in the UK. It did bring in a wider range of stakeholders that have to be included in corporate decisions, but it didn't, and it won't, and it can't undermine the basic duties that I've described, the basic fiduciary duties of directors, because to do that would be to undermine the model. So that's a very complex and roundabout way of saying yes. The model is geared up to prioritise private gain always over public interest. So that's the first point. The second point I would say is it's not just, I'm not sure it's just about corruption by design. The system is also maintained in a way that in which the dice are loaded, right? In which the system is rigged for the benefit of the largest corporations and for the benefit of owners and shareholders. And one of the clearest ways that the system is rigged is through the subsidies that governments provide to almost every sector. Certainly, if you look at almost all of the privatised industries in the UK remain heavily subsidised, whether that's energy, rail. And one of the reasons that rail providers have been brought back into the public sector is because of the obvious and replete waste of public money that's been thrown at them, whether it's Virgin on the East Coast Line or wherever it is. About a third of research and development is public sector money anyway, and that doesn't even include all of the university stuff. When we put people as taxpayers, pay for people to go through the schooling system, and then when we, even though people are paying fees, the taxpayer is going to bail out the fee system very soon. That started to happen. We're effectively paying for that system. So we pay for people to go through university. Most people who go through university end up in the private sector, highly trained individuals that companies never have to pay for. And if you look at even the key cash cow sectors for the UK economy, there are huge subsidies. The oil industry is a really good case. Oil industry has always been subject by successive governments at various points when it falls into difficulty to exceptional tax breaks and exceptional tax structures. And the latest here comes from the Financial Times today, actually, where I mean, this is actually more honest reporting about the nature of public subsidies that we normally get. Now, it looks like we as taxpayers are going to have to pay for the entire cost of the decommissioning of the North Sea, about 24 billion. So we've said to the oil companies, okay, you invest in this infrastructure, you profit from this infrastructure, we give you tax breaks as you're doing so. In fact, a lot of tax breaks were given to develop the infrastructure. And now at the end of it, you just leave everything and we clear it up after you've left, or after you've run off with the money. We end up paying 24 billion in the midst of one of the harshest public sector financial crises because of austerity that we've seen for years, and we do this. So the hidden subsidies to business, if we looked at almost any sector, we would find some form of hidden subsidy, and we would find some form of externality. So in that sense, the system is rigged for corporations, right? So the things that we've been taught and told, and were the rationales for neoliberal reforms for now almost 40 years, that the private sector is more efficient, in many respects it's more effective, is clearly a lie. Yeah. There's a river, maybe, but it's gushing up. It's not trickling down. Yeah. So we also need to raise some kind of profound questions. Now, I'm not arguing for a public sector model like the public sector model we used to have. I happen to think that there are parts of Europe, but parts of the world where there are interesting experiments going on about how we bring essential services and highly inefficient, despite the claims of efficiency, inefficient services back into public provision in ways that are accountable and in ways that ordinary people can have a say over, right? And I think some of those kind of models could be imported here. There are some interesting experiments around energy sovereignty, where local people have decisions about where their energy comes from, i.e. from sustainable sources that are owned and controlled by local people themselves, in Catalonia, for example. And I think we could do well to look to other parts of the world where people are beginning to see the economy is not working for us, and it's not working for us largely because of the concentration of power in corporations. Mm-hmm. So how do we break that model, and how do we develop alternatives? But I'm afraid the starting point is the corporation, because it's the dominant institution in our economy. It's where political power as well as economic power is concentrated. And that's something that we need to deal with, or else we just end up perpetuating the same problems, whether it's climate change, the production of human harms, fraud, corruption, and so on. Mm.
That seems like a good place to end. So, David Whyte, thanks very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Anthony.
See you next time.